Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we are diving into chapter 54 of our GWave series. We are going to explore how our expectations shape our emotional responses using the classic example of Pavlov's dog. So let's get started. If our book had a main character, it would definitely be the dog from Pavlov's experiments. Let's imagine this. After establishing a pairing between a bell and food for our main character, what happens the next time we ring the bell but don't provide any food? Behaviorally, the dog will still salivate, but this salivation will gradually stop as it realizes there's no food. But what about the dog's emotional response? Similar to how humans feel when a good expectation isn't met, I'd guess our main character would feel a sense of loss. When the bell rings, there are no other changes in the dog's environment, but internally, it experiences an emotional shift. Essentially, the bell activates the dog's expectation of pleasure, but the subsequent sensory G waves input doesn't strongly activate the same series of G waves that produce the expected G waves. This leads to a possible feeling of loss. We can't guarantee that the dog will definitely feel this way, but humans in similar situations often do. For example, when you expect to succeed in asking someone out but get rejected, or when you expect to get into college but for the exam. In these cases, people's emotional responses are usually unpleasant, varying in intensity depending on the situation, but we can generally describe them as feelings of loss. If the subject doesn't have corresponding expectations, then the subsequent lack of environmental feedback doesn't matter, and is less likely to produce a subsequent sense of loss. Loss, as an emotional state, indicates that a certain type of G waves is presented in the G waves display area. So, how are these G waves generated? Let's deduce this. Before the bell rings, the dog's brain hasn't activated the corresponding food G, so it hasn't activated the pleasure sub G connected to the food G, and thus hasn't produced the expected G waves of happiness. After the bell rings, these G waves are all activated, and the expected G waves of happiness appear, leading to salivation. Next, the input sensory G waves don't contain the corresponding characteristic structures of the food, so the food G isn't further activated. Instead, it activates the environmental G of food absence. At this point, the food G that produced the happy expectation forms a G connection with this environmental G due to the simultaneous activation effects. Then the dog's possible sense of loss is generated, meaning its discomfort instinctive sub G is activated. In this example, only the activation of the food G won't lead to the activation of the discomfort sub G. Similarly, only the activation of the environmental G of food absence won't lead to the activation of the discomfort sub G. Additionally, Once the environmental G of food absence is activated, there won't be continued activation of the food G that produces happy expectations. So, the activation of this environmental G is like opening a pathway. This pathway allows the G waves that produce happy expectations to pass through and transform into G waves that activate the discomfort sub G. If we follow this reasoning, then the environmental G as a conversion pathway must have a strong attractive effect on the happy expectation G waves. At the same time, this environmental G will also reshape the happy expectation G waves, making them form G waves that activate the discomfort sub G. This understanding makes sense, but we can also look at it from other angle using G theory. When the bell rings, the food G is activated, and expected the expected G waves are produced. The content of the expectation is the appearance of corresponding food in the environment. The content of the subsequent sensory G waves input is the absence of that food in the environment. After the sensory G waves input, because it doesn't contain the characteristic structures of the food G can't be further activated, and the expected G waves of pleasure can't continue to be produced. The already produced expected G waves will combine with the sensory G waves or combine with the G waves produced after the activation of the environmental G of food absence. An important characteristic structure of the combination is that the expected pleasure hasn't appeared. The combined G waves can activate the corresponding pleasure sub G due to their characteristic structures. Instead, they activate the corresponding discomfort sub G. The above two analyses, one focusing on the G and the other on the G waves, are both somewhat one-sided, but neither can be ignored. The distribution and activation level of G can influence the projection direction and the degree of G waves. The combination of characteristic structure in G waves determines which type of G they will activate next. If you think deeper and consider the G waves display area with projection function as a G connection, you will find that the above two analyses are actually two different descriptions of the same already. Regardless of analysis, they both suggest that under the simple activation state of this field G, excluding the inference of other G activations, the more or the greater the production of expected G waves, the more or greater the activation of G waves that activate the corresponding discomfort sub G after the environment doesn't fulfill the expectation. Therefore, the more obvious the sense of loss, which is exactly what people usually say, the greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. Similarly, we can understand why the greater the harmful expectation, the greater the relief when subsequent environmental input makes the expectation unfulfilled. For example, a patient diagnosed with cancer who later finds out it was a diagnosis would be so relieved that they wouldn't even want to argue with the doctor. Here's a question to ponder. If the main character's expectation is extremely strong and there's a problem with the subsequent environmental input pathway, what might happen to the main character? How can we view Plankton Lame pain from this perspective? Okay, that's all the content today. See you next time. Bye bye.